My name is Harold. I'm 74 years old, and I have to be honest with you about something. For the last 16 years, I have been eating alone. My wife Betty passed in 2008, and for the first year after she was gone, I lived almost entirely on frozen dinners from the grocery store, microwave meatloaf in plastic trays, canned soup heated on the stove and eaten standing at the counter. Those little single-serve containers of macaroni you peel back the foil on and heat for 90 seconds. I told myself it was easier. I told myself I didn't know how to cook for one. I told myself that all those things Betty used to make, the things that filled the house with the right smells on a winter evening in Ohio, those were too complicated for a man on his own. I was wrong. And what I didn't understand then was that I had already been taught everything I needed. I just hadn't been paying attention. You see, I grew up watching my mother cook. Not fancy cooking, not restaurant cooking, one-pot cooking. The kind of cooking that stretches $1 worth of something into 3 days of eating. The kind of cooking that came from a generation that understood something we have completely lost. That cooking for one is not sad. It is not hard. It is, when you know how, a genuine act of looking after yourself. I want to tell you about 20 meals I've rediscovered. Meals my mother made. Meals the women on our block made in the 1950s and 60s. Meals that cost almost nothing, take almost no effort, and taste better than anything wrapped in plastic that you will ever pull out of a supermarket freezer. But first, I need to tell you something that stopped me in my tracks when I found it out. Number 14 on this list, the potato and cheese skillet, was actually recommended by visiting nurses in the 1960s. Recommended. To elderly patients living alone who struggled to cook. There were nurses going door to door in towns like mine teaching this. And here we are, 60 years later, buying frozen dinners for $6 that taste of salt and nothing else. Let me explain how I got here. Honestly, the first time I made oatmeal after Betty died, I burned it. I put the heat too high, went to find the remote, and came back to a pot of black paste stuck to the bottom. She would have laughed. She always said I had no patience with a stove. But I tried again, and the second time I got it right. 1 cup of rolled oats, 2 cups of water, a pinch of salt stirred in the night before, which softens the grain while you sleep. 5 minutes of gentle simmering in the morning. That was it. And here's what I didn't understand then. That little pinch of salt the night before makes all the difference. The grain opens up differently. The texture becomes something else entirely. Creamy in a way that costs next to nothing. My mother used to save the cream off the top of the milk. You remember that? Before homogenized milk took over, there was a thick layer of cream that gathered at the top of the bottle. She would skim that off and stir it through the oatmeal right at the last moment. We thought she was being fancy. She was being smart. A canister of rolled oats costs less than $4 and lasts a month. That is breakfast for 30 days for less than $4. Compare that to the individual instant oatmeal packets at $1.50 each. My mother would not have understood that. She would have called it a waste, and she would have been absolutely right. You know what surprised me most? How quickly these meals came back to me once I started trying. It was like the knowledge was still there somewhere, waiting. I just had to reach for it. After I got the oatmeal right, I moved on to beef vegetable soup. Now this one I remembered clearly because the smell of it simmering is one of the most specific memories I have of childhood in rural Indiana. The broth. That is the secret of good vegetable beef soup. Not the fancy cuts of meat, which you barely need, but the long, slow cook that pulls everything out of the bones and vegetables. A small piece of beef chuck, maybe a quarter pound, some diced carrots and potatoes, a stalk of celery, if I had one, and a handful of barley or dried beans. Everything into the pot, together with enough cold water to cover, brought slowly to a simmer, left alone. The vegetables soften and the broth deepens as it cooks until you have something closer to a stew than a soup, something that coats the spoon and fills the belly in a way that a can of Campbell's never manages. I make it on a Monday morning and it keeps going until Wednesday. The flavour deepens each time I reheat it. The second serving is better than the first. The third is better still. Let me tell you something about the USDA food surveys from the late 1950s. Bean and vegetable consumption among senior citizens stayed steady right through the 50s and 60s, even as younger families abandoned them for processed foods. The reason was simple. The older women knew what these ingredients did. They knew they stretched. They knew they thickened. They knew that a handful cost almost nothing and turned a small piece of cheap meat into a meal that lasted days. We stopped knowing that. And I didn't know it at the time, but losing that knowledge cost me 16 years of eating badly when I didn't have to. I should tell you about egg drop soup made the American way, because this one genuinely surprised me. When the Social Security check runs short toward the end of the month, this is what I make now. You heat up chicken broth from a can or a cube. When it simmers, you beat 2 eggs in a cup with a pinch of salt and pour them slowly into the pot while you stir gently. The egg sets into ribbons, silky golden ribbons that turn plain broth into something that looks and tastes like it took effort. Then I add whatever I have, a handful of frozen corn, a few leftover green beans from dinner 2 nights ago. Suddenly there is supper. In 1962, a dozen eggs cost about 30 cents at the A&P. A single egg cost barely 2.5 cents. This was cooking at its most elemental. No chopping, no standing over a hot stove with aching knees, no complicated steps. The whole thing takes 5 minutes and dirties 1 pot and 1 cup. Honestly, I make this now when I am tired and I do not want to think. It never fails. Visiting nurses in cities like Cincinnati and Columbus reportedly taught this recipe in the 1960s to elderly patients who struggled with complex cooking. The protein from the egg, the warmth of the broth, the ease of preparation. They called it medicine disguised as supper. I think that is exactly right. Now here is something I want to stop and tell you, because this next part genuinely made me angry when I found it out. The USDA Extension Service, that government institution that taught a generation of American homemakers how to cook nutritiously from almost nothing, published pamphlets specifically for elderly citizens living alone starting in the 1940s. They contained advice that modern nutritionists are only now, 80 years later, starting to rediscover. Those pamphlets recommended one-pot meals, not just for convenience, but for nutrition. They argued that slow-cooked dishes retained more nutrients than quick frying. They said the liquid from cooked vegetables should always be used in soups and gravies, never poured down the drain. These were not suggestions born of sentiment. These were survival strategies developed during the Depression and the war years and refined through necessity. What those home economists understood, and what we have almost entirely forgotten, is that cooking for one is a skill. It requires different techniques than cooking for a family. Smaller portions, less waste, simpler methods. Your grandmother learned these things not from a cooking show, but from absolute necessity. And those skills are what we need to reclaim. I am angry because nobody told me this when Betty died. I came home from the hospital with a grief counselling brochure and a casserole from the neighbours that lasted 3 days. Nobody said, "Here is how to feed yourself properly when you are living alone for the first time." Nobody said, "The women of your mother's generation already worked all of this out." Let me tell you about the potato and cheese skillet, the one the visiting nurses recommended. 1 small onion, diced and cooked in a little butter until soft. A handful of cubed potatoes added with just enough milk to cover. Simmer until tender. Then top with shredded cheddar and put a lid on for 2 minutes until it melts. The whole thing made in a single cast iron skillet and eaten right out of it if you want. No more washing up than 1 pan and 1 fork. In 1963, a block of cheddar cost about 30 cents and lasted a week for 1 person. The dish asked nothing of tired hands or fading eyesight. No precise timing, no complicated steps, just gentle simmering and patience. I read once about interviews with widows from small towns in Ohio and Kentucky, who recalled making this every Tuesday evening. The smell of melting cheese drifting through the neighbourhood. For those living alone, the warm skillet held between the hands was as comforting as the food itself. I understand that completely now. I understand it in a way I could not have understood before I started living alone. You see, there is something about a warm pan in the hands in a quiet kitchen that I cannot fully explain. It is something to do with not being helpless, with having made something, with knowing that you took nothing and turned it into something that keeps you warm and fed and going. Here is where things get interesting, and here is what I want you to really hear. The frozen dinner industry built $1 billion empire on a single assumption, that people living alone cannot cook, that we will not cook, that convenience matters more than anything else. They sell single-serve portions of pot roast for $6 that cost 60 cents to produce. They marketed minute rice as convenience when a pot of rice takes 20 minutes and costs a fraction of the price. They wrapped everything in plastic and cardboard and told us it was progress. My mother would have laughed. She would have genuinely laughed and then been furious. She knew that one pot, one burner on the stove, and one set of basic skills could produce meals that any factory cannot match. The tragedy is not that these recipes were forgotten. The tragedy is that we were convinced to forget them. Every senior citizen eating a cold, frozen dinner alone has been failed, not by their own abilities, but by an industry that profits from their learned helplessness. I find that very hard to forgive. So let me tell you about split pea soup with ham, because this one costs almost nothing and is, I will tell you honestly, one of the most satisfying things I eat. Split peas. This was my mother's secret weapon. Unlike dried beans, they need no soaking at all and cook in 30 minutes. I save the bone from a Sunday ham and keep it in the freezer. When I need it, I put it in a pot with a cup of split peas, a diced onion, a sliced carrot, and enough water to cover. I simmer the pot for an hour until the peas collapse into a thick, warming soup. The whole pot costs less than $2 and lasts 2 days. In 1958, a pound of split peas cost about 15 cents. A ham bone that the butcher might have thrown away. Home economics teachers in places like Dayton and Louisville distributed mimeographed copies of this recipe throughout the 1950s and 60s to elderly residents on fixed incomes. The protein from the peas, the flavour from the ham, the vitamins from the vegetables, a complete meal in one pot. The smell of its simmering was, for many of the women of that generation, the smell of getting through the week, of managing, of stretching a fixed income to the end of the month. I know that smell now, and I understand it differently than I would have 20 years ago. Let me tell you about a grilled cheese done right, because I want you to know that these meals were not just about survival. They were about pleasure too. This is not a sandwich slapped together with American singles. This is something far more satisfying. I butter 2 slices of day-old white bread on the outside. Inside, I put sharp cheddar, a thin slice of tomato, and a smear of yellow mustard. Cook slowly in a dry skillet on medium-low heat, pressed down with a spatula until both sides are deeply golden and the cheese is completely melted through. The result is crisp, rich, and deeply satisfying. In 1962, the ingredients cost less than a quarter and provided a complete supper. Honestly, the first time I made this the right way, slowly, with real cheddar and patience, I sat down at the kitchen table and felt something I had not felt in a long time, something close to proper contentment. Not because of the food itself, though it was very good, but because I had made it, because I had taken nothing particularly impressive and turned it into something that tasted like it came from somewhere that cared. I want to tell you about chicken soup made from a whole chicken, because my mother did this, and I watched her do it, and then I forgot it entirely for 40 years, and I am embarrassed about that. When I buy a whole chicken, I use it 3 times now. The first day, roasted in the oven. The second day, cold slices in a sandwich with pickle. The third day, the carcass goes into a pot with an onion, a couple of carrots, a stalk of celery, some peppercorns, and enough cold water to cover. It simmers for 2 hours, and the bones release something into the liquid that you cannot describe, but you can absolutely taste. I strain it, season it, add some egg noodles, and stir back in whatever scraps of meat I picked from the bones. This soup costs almost nothing beyond the time it takes. In 1956, a whole fryer chicken cost about 60 cents at the grocery store. The soup extended that investment by another 2 meals at almost no additional cost. For those of us living alone, this is not just economy. It is a kind of skill that was passed down through generations of American families, and that we were somehow persuaded to abandon when convenience foods took over. The smell of chicken stock on the back of the stove means nothing was wasted. Every penny was stretched as far as it could go. My mother never threw away a chicken carcass in her life. I threw them away for 40 years. I will not throw another one away as long as I live. Let me tell you about macaroni and cheese made from scratch, because this is perhaps the meal that most surprised me when I made it properly for the first time. I had eaten boxed macaroni and cheese hundreds of times, the kind with the orange powder packet. I thought I knew what it tasted like. I did not know what it actually could taste like. My grandmother made it all in one pot. She boiled the macaroni until just tender, drained most of the water but left a little, then stirred in a generous knob of butter, a splash of whole milk, and a big handful of sharp cheddar. Stirred on low heat until the cheese melted into a sauce that clung to every piece of pasta. A shake of dry mustard lifted the flavour. Breadcrumbs from day-old bread, browned under the broiler, added a crust that no box mix ever has. In 1958, the ingredients for one serving cost less than 20 cents. The box version, when it became popular, cost 3 times as much and tasted of artificial cheese powder and salt. For those of us living alone, this is the kind of comfort that no factory can replicate. The pull of real melting cheese, the smell of butter and mustard, the warmth of the bowl between the hands. That warmth is real. It is not something a microwave can produce. Not the same warmth. I need to tell you about bread and warm milk, because I know some of you will think this is too simple to mention, and I want to tell you that you are wrong. Bread and warm milk was the simplest supper of all, and perhaps the most misunderstood. You tear day-old white bread into a bowl. You pour warm milk over it. You add a spoonful of sugar or a drizzle of honey, and eat it right away. It is sick-room food. It is the food your mother made when you had a fever or a stomachache and could not eat anything else. For those with sore gums or dental problems, for those too tired to chew, for those whose appetites have shrunk with age, bread and milk is nourishment without struggle. Some people beat an egg into the warm milk for protein. Others add a spoonful of jam from the refrigerator door. The variations are endless. In 1952, a loaf of Wonder Bread cost about 16 cents, and a quart of milk cost 21 cents. A serving cost a few pennies. This is not depression food. This is survival food, perfected over generations and served without shame. I have eaten it on evenings when I did not feel well, and on evenings when I was simply tired, and on evenings when the thought of cooking anything was too much. And every time it has done exactly what it was supposed to do. My mother made it for me when I was sick as a boy. I make it for myself now when I need it. There is something right about that. And the last one. The one that I think about most. Beef stew made slow. A small piece of chuck roast, maybe half a pound, cut into cubes. Browned in a pot with a diced onion until the meat has some colour. Enough beef broth or water added to cover, along with a couple of carrots, 2 potatoes cut up, a bay leaf, and whatever herbs I have on hand. Simmered slowly on the lowest heat for 2 to 3 hours until the meat is falling apart tender and the gravy has turned thick and dark. In 1955, chuck roast cost about 40 cents a pound. Half a pound cost 20 cents. That 20 cents, with vegetables, produced a meal that could easily stretch to 2 servings, each one more satisfying than any frozen dinner ever made. The pot sits on the back burner, requiring nothing but time. The smell fills the apartment or the house. The taste, rich and deep and properly savoury, proves something important. That cooking for one can be an act of self-respect. That the meals the women of my mother's generation made from almost nothing were not poor meals. They were skilled meals. They were meals made by people who understood what they were doing. I did not understand any of this when Betty died. I told myself I couldn't cook, that it was too complicated, that it wasn't worth it for just one person. I told myself those lies for 16 years. They were not true. None of them were true. Here is my challenge to you. Try one of these this week, just one. The split pea soup, the potato and cheese skillet, the slow beef stew. Make it slowly. Eat it at your own kitchen table. See if it does not taste better than anything in a plastic tray that you heat in the microwave. These meals were not forgotten by accident. They were systematically replaced by an industry that profits from your convenience and your loneliness. Your grandmother, your mother, the women on your block knew how to feed themselves well on almost nothing. That knowledge is not lost. It has been waiting. Now you know it too. If this brought back any memories for you, I would love to hear them. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your mother or grandmother used to make. And if you know someone who is living alone and eating badly, please share this with them. It might be the most useful thing they see all week. I'll be back next week with more of what I've been learning. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. There is more to come.